It's strange how certain memories never truly fade. No matter how much time passes, you go years without thinking about them, and then, out of nowhere, they hit you like a cold gust of wind. For me, it's the sound of footsteps in the middle of the night. Every now and then, I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, and for a moment, I'm 8 years old again, lying in that creaky old bed, terrified to breathe. I was just a kid when it happened. My parents had died in a car accident, and my grandparents took me in. They tried their best to make me feel at home, but I don't think any of us really knew how to deal with the grief. A few months after the funeral, my grandfather announced that we were moving. He'd bought a big property in the countryside, a house with a massive backyard overrun with weeds and vines. The price was shockingly low, but he brushed off any concerns. "It's just a dumb story," he'd said with a wave of his hand. I didn't ask what story he meant, and honestly, I didn't care. I was too young to understand the weight of those words. Looking back now, I wonder if he ever really believed what he said. Maybe he just wanted to start over somewhere fresh, somewhere he could plant his feet and forget about the past. But that house, it had a history, one I wasn't ready for. As an adult, I try to make sense of what happened back then, but the memories are scattered, like pieces of a puzzle that refuse to fit together. What I do remember clearly, vividly, is the well and the footsteps. Always the footsteps. The first few nights in the new house were quiet enough, or at least I thought they were. It wasn't until the third or fourth night that I started noticing the footsteps. They weren't loud or rushed, just soft, steady taps, like someone walking barefoot on the wooden floors. At first, I figured it was my grandparents, maybe getting up to check the doors or grab a drink of water. I didn't think much of it, but the pattern was strange. It always happened around the same time, just past midnight. At 8 years old, you don't question much, but something about it didn't sit right. I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between each step until they stopped. When I finally drifted off to sleep, I'd convinced myself it was nothing. A few days later, while helping unpack and organize my room, I stumbled across something unusual. There was an old cabinet in the corner, one of those heavy wooden ones that creaked when you opened it. As I cleared out the drawers, I found a small compartment at the back. It wasn't exactly hidden, but it looked like no one had opened it in years. Inside there was a book. It was strange, no pictures, no letters, just rows of tiny raised dots on every page. I had no idea what it was. I showed it to my grandmother, and she explained it was a Braille book, something blind people used to read. Maybe it belonged to someone who lived here before us, she said casually, brushing it off like it was no big deal. But it was a big deal to me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Why was it still here? Why had no one taken it with them? The dots fascinated me, even though I couldn't read them. I'd run my fingers over the bumps, trying to imagine what kind of story was written there. One afternoon, while flipping through its pages, I felt it. A warm breath on the back of my neck. I froze, my hands gripping the book tightly. Slowly, I turned around, expecting to see my grandmother standing behind me, but there was no one there. The room felt colder than before, and my chest tightened with a creeping sense of dread. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. A few nights later, the power went out during a thunderstorm. I remember fumbling my way to the bathroom in the dark, using my hands to guide me along the walls. When I got back to my room, I froze in the doorway. There was a figure sitting on my bed, A woman, or at least what looked like one. Her silhouette was dark, motionless, and unmistakably human. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat, and then, just like that, the lights flickered back on. My bed was empty. I didn't sleep much that night. I didn't tell my grandparents either. What could I say? That I saw something that disappeared the second the lights came back. I figured they'd brush it off like I was just a scared kid with an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew something was wrong with that house. Something I couldn't explain. One afternoon, my grandmother had a doctor's appointment, and my grandfather was out some work. That left me alone in the house. Before leaving, my grandmother made sure to give me a stern warning. Don't open the door for anyone, and don't go wandering outside, you hear me? I nodded, not planning to break the rules, at least, not at first. But the hours crawled by, and the house felt suffocatingly quiet. I tried distracting myself with toys, but my curiosity kept pulling me to the backyard. I'd heard my grandparents talk about how overgrown the jungle-like backyard was. They called it a headache, but to me it seemed like an adventure waiting to happen. Before I knew it, I was out the back door, slipping past the tall grass and tangles of bushes. The air was humid, and the earthy smell of wet leaves filled my nose. I climbed a fruit tree, grabbing whatever I could reach, guavas, maybe, though I didn't care what they were. That's when I saw her. She was sitting on the edge of the well at the far end of the yard, her back to me. Her long black hair draped over her shoulders like a curtain, and her head tilted slightly downward. Everything about her felt wrong. The air seemed colder, heavier, like the entire jungle was holding its breath. I didn't wait to see what she'd do. I climbed down as fast as I could and sprinted back to the house, slamming the door behind me and locking it. When my grandmother returned, I didn't say a word about what I saw. I didn't want her to know I'd disobeyed her. The next day, she asked me to help her gather firewood from the backyard. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't tell her why. I stayed close, sticking to her side as we picked up sticks and dried branches. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps. Only this time they weren't on the ground. They were coming from inside the well. I froze, my arms full of sticks, and turned to look. My grandmother didn't seem to hear anything, but I couldn't ignore it. The sound of feet tapping against stone, getting louder, echoed up from the well. I couldn't stop myself. I stepped closer, peering over the edge. She was there, staring up at me with hollow, black eyes. Her limbs moved unnaturally, jerking and twisting as she began to climb the walls of the well. I screamed, dropping everything, and ran straight to my grandmother. I didn't care about hiding it anymore. I told her everything. The footsteps at night, the silhouette in my room, the woman at the well. My grandmother looked at me with a mix of confusion and worry. She didn't say much, but she held me close, murmuring something about needing to tell my grandfather. When my grandfather got home that evening, my grandmother wasted no time telling him everything I'd shared. She spoke in hurried whispers, her eyes darting toward me as I sat silently at the kitchen table. At first, he just sighed, shaking his head like it was all too much. "The boy's just scared," he muttered, but then his expression changed. Something about the way she described the well made him pause. He rubbed his hands over his face, like he was debating whether to say something or not. "I've heard things too," he finally admitted, almost begrudgingly. "Footsteps. But I thought it was just this old house creaking at night." That confession hung in the air, thick and heavy. For the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in my grandfather's eyes, the kind he was usually so good at hiding. They talked in low voices while I sat there, my stomach twisting into knots. I didn't need to hear everything to know what they were deciding. By the time the dishes were washed and the lights were dimmed, it was clear we weren't staying here any longer than we had to. We packed essentials before bed, planning to leave first thing in the morning. My grandmother kept saying, "It's better to be safe than sorry," like she was trying to convince herself more than anyone else. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying not to think about the well, or the woman, or those empty black eyes. But the silence was too loud. Every creak, every rustle of leaves outside made my skin crawl. And then like clockwork they came. The footsteps. They started faintly somewhere down the hall, the sound of bare feet against wooden floors. They grew louder, closer, each step deliberate and steady. I wanted to scream for my grandparents, but fear locked my throat. My hands clutched the blanket tighter as the footsteps stopped, right outside my door. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I stared at the sliver of light under the door, expecting to see shadows shifting, but there was nothing, just the silence pressing down on me. I pulled the blanket over my head, curling up as small as I could, and prayed for the sun to rise. I don't know how long I stayed like that, trembling under the covers, but eventually exhaustion won. When I opened my eyes, it was morning. The room was bright, and everything seemed normal again. But I didn't trust it. I didn't trust this house, not for a second. By the time my grandparents came to wake me, I was already dressed, my bag packed and ready to go. We didn't even stay for breakfast. It wasn't until years later that I learned the truth about that house. By then, I was old enough to see my grandparents as more than just the steady, unshakable people I thought they were when I was 8. I overheard them talking one evening during a family gathering. They were sitting at the edge of the porch, voices low but not low enough to escape my curiosity. "Do you remember that house?" My grandmother asked, her tone uneasy. "The one with the well." My grandfather grunted in response, but she pressed on. "I've been thinking about it. About the girl. You remember the story, don't you?" He sighed. "Yes, the blind girl. Never sat right with me." My heart skipped a beat. I edged closer, careful not to make a sound. Apparently, the house once belonged to an older couple and their blind adult daughter. The girl had lived with them her entire life, keeping mostly to herself. One day, though, she vanished. Nobody knew where she went until they found her body floating in the well. Some said it was murder. Others thought it was an accident, maybe a misstep in the dark. But nothing was ever proven, and the case faded into whispers and rumors. The townsfolk decided the house was cursed, and stories about her spirit haunting the well began to circulate. That's why the house was so cheap, my grandmother said. It wasn't just a dumb story. Hearing this made my stomach churn, even after all those years. The memories of that place came flooding back. Those cold footsteps in the hallway, the shadow on my bed, and the woman by the well with her empty black eyes. I wonder if she's still there, trapped, waiting for someone else to hear her story. Or maybe it's better that no one ever finds out what really happened. All I know is, I've never gone back and I never will.